This week's constellations, we actually have 5, although I don't test on the last 2, but Aquila, Lyra, and Cygnus, as well as the smaller constellations Delphinus and Sagitta. Fairly large part of the sky for these constellations. Start off with Cygnus here, which is the swan. And as a swan, the top of it is the tail, the bottom of it is the tip of its beak, and then the 2 outstretched parts are the wings. They actually extend a bit farther out than that. The asterism is also known as the Northern Cross, and so you may hear it as that sometimes. But Cygnus the swan is what we have here. Below that, and by the way, these orientations change considerably throughout the night from when these constellations are rising in the east to when they're setting in the west. So they can get tipped in all sorts of different directions. Also, they pass directly overhead, and because they do, you might be viewing them when your feet are aimed south or west or north or east, and so you can see all sorts of different orientations for that reason as well. This is Lyra down here. Lyra is supposed to represent a harp. The most distinctive feature is that little parallelogram there, so that's what you tend to see, although the bright star in it does catch your eye. And then over here is Aquila, the name of which I've heard Aquila, Aquila, let's see, Aquila. I'm trying to think of all the different pronunciations I've heard for this constellation, but I'm going to try to say Aquila. That's close to the Italian or the Spanish pronunciation of the word. And so it means eagle, and it's supposed to represent an eagle, although I don't really see an eagle here. So, and then here is one of our 2 smaller constellations for the week. This is Sagitta, the arrow, and supposedly shot by Sagittarius, the archer. And here is Delphinus, the dolphin, and in this orientation it's a little hard to imagine that as a dolphin, but I'll show you another slide that maybe you can see that then. Cygnus up here again, and we have quite a few star names in this week's constellations. Not a huge number, but more than usual, but some weeks we don't have any star names, so it balances out. Deneb is up here. Deneb is a word associated with tail, so that's the tail of the swan. And Sadr, I'm not sure what the meaning of that word is. There's a Sadr city outside of Baghdad. Current day there is. And then Alberio down here. If you can ever get under the night sky with a group of people with telescopes and Cygnus happens to be above the horizon, ask them to show you Alberio through the telescope. It's a treat. Okay, Lyra down here. The one star in it to know is Vega, and it stands out. So Vega's one of the brighter stars in the sky. And then over here, Aquila, and Altair is the bright star in Aquila, and it also stands out from the rest of the stars in the constellations, so easy to see. Okay, another slide here. We're going to look at an asterism that's formed of stars in 3 different constellations. Deneb is in Cygnus the swan, Vega is in Lyra the harp, and then Altair over here is in Aquila. And these 3 stars form an asterism that is high overhead on summer evenings, and we call it the summer triangle. So there you see it. And I'll flash in and out of this a couple of times so you can get the hang of it. Fade away. You can kind of see the triangle there. It's actually maybe easier to see this in the actual sky than it is on a computer slide. The summer triangle. Okay, now here's a different orientation for these things, but one that you might see perhaps when these things are rising in the east. You might notice an orientation like this. So Cygnus there, Lyra there, Aquila over there. Yet another orientation for these things. There's Lyra up there. Vega would be the very top star in it in this orientation. Cygnus there. Deneb would be the very top star in that orientation. Okay, this shows more of the complete asterism, or at least the one that I have seen often for Aquila. And I had a student say, that looks like a Starfleet emblem. So if you're a Star Trek fan, that kind of looks like the emblem that the people in Star Trek have on their uniforms. So maybe you can associate that with it. But again, it's supposed to be an eagle. I don't see an eagle. Actually, if it's an eagle, it includes a bunch of stars out here on this side of it as well. But not something that you would see under modern town skies with lots of streetlights. Okay, you might be able to think of that as a dolphin. The right end of that would be its tail, and the left end would be the tip of its nose. So maybe a leaping dolphin there. I can actually kind of imagine that. A lot of these shapes I can't do so well with. And then Sagitta, the arrow is right up there. So, and over here is something you might recognize, maybe not. Anyway, we'll start putting names on these things. Cygnus up there, Lyra there, Aquila down here, Ophiuchus there, and that one line of stars that's going up there between Aquila and Ophiuchus is part of Serpens. That'd be Serpens cauda, the tail of the snake. And I don't put labels on Sagitta and Delphinus, I don't think, in here. But I do circle something here. And this is a favorite binocular object. It's not super easy to spot because it seems like most of the times I've been out looking at this through binoculars, this has been almost straight up, and it's kind of a neck killer when you're looking at something that's straight over your head. But here's a blown up picture of it. It's called Brachy's cluster. And if you look at those bright stars in that image, you might start forming some other image in your mind if we connect the dots. Or if you see the alternate name of it. Now, this is not an ancient Greek name, this is a modern name, but a lot of people call this the coat hanger. So you can kind of see why. Okay, here are some other things that are in this part of the sky. This is a long time exposure picture that reveals this. You're not going to see this with the naked eye, but it's showing some nebulosity. Nebulosity is a term, or nebula is a word for cloud. And there's some clouds of gas and dust in this part of the sky. So, yeah, that. And just for orientation, there's Deneb, and then there's Solder. So Solder is where the cross piece, or the wings, cross the body of the swan, and Deneb is the tail. So you can kind of see that, but many different nebula here. And the first one is something here, the North American Nebula. And you can look at that and almost imagine that, almost right where the tip of the arrow is sort of the Mexico and Central America, and that dark spot in there might be the Gulf of Mexico. So that's how that gets the name of the North American Nebula. I've heard or read about people who could see this with the naked eye, and I've laid on my back on a lawn chair under very dark skies and stared up at this part of the sky, and I just don't see it. I see nothing but stars up there with maybe just a hint of fuzziness. It's a challenge to see anyway. And then next to the North American Nebula is the Pelican Nebula, which it's kind of a stretch looking at this. I've got a more blown up picture of it that you might get that out of a little better. And also in this part of the sky, something called the Crescent Nebula. These would be definite telescope objects. They would be small enough that they'd show up better in a telescope. You'd probably have to have some kind of a filter on it to bring out the nebulosity. And another one called the Tulip Nebula. And also in here is this region called the Northern Coal Sack. This is actually a cloud of cold, dark matter, or not dark matter, but cold gas and dust that's in between us and the brighter nebula region. And so it blocks the light from the things behind it. So coal sack is probably pretty good. There's a fair amount of carbon typically in these clouds of dust and gas. Okay, now you might be able to imagine a pelican in here. The tip of the head is up there at the top, and then the beak is headed down and to the left from there. So maybe you can imagine a pelican. And there's a little line from a poem that was written way back in the 1800s, I think. Okay, here's a close-up picture of Lyra the harp, and you can maybe kind of see something in here. I wonder if I can draw on this thing. I think I can. Whoops, I can't. Maybe I can. Take my red pen here. So here is Vega. This star here is something known as Epsilon Lyra, and it's a popular telescope object. It's called the double-double. If you look through it at a telescope and it's well in focus, you can see that it's a double star, and if you've got a good telescope and nice calm skies, you can zoom in on that, get a higher magnification, and actually see that each of the two stars in the double star is itself a double star. So it's known as the double-double. But the object of our interest right here is down here between those two stars in the parallelogram for Lyra, and it's not showing up in here yet. It is not a naked eye object, but it's known as the Ring Nebula. And through one of our school telescopes, that will look like a little faint gray donut. And through the Hubble Space Telescope, which they spent a little bit more money on that than we did on our school telescopes, by a factor of maybe 100 million or so. Anyway, this is what it looks like. And this is a planetary nebula. The word planetary is a misname in this case. It doesn't have anything to do with planets. It is a cloud of gas that's given off by a star like our sun toward the very end of its life. And the sun will do this eventually. And it's not an explosion. It's just a gentle puffing away of the outer layers of the sun. And then the core that's left behind is very hot, and gives off a lot of ultraviolet light, which will cause the cloud of gas that was puffed off to fluoresce. And so it'll glow like that. And that's what's going on here. I don't know which of the two stars in the middle of that ring happened to be the star that produced it. Sometimes it's not necessarily the one right at the center. We're actually looking through the nebula to see this, and you can confuse background stars with the one that actually produced the nebula. And that is it for this group of stars. Quite a bit more information here than some